Hello, I'm Tony Collins and this is the Rugby Reloaded podcast. This week I'm going to pick up one of the threads from last week's episode on the William Webb Ellis myth and ask why soccer and not rugby became the dominant code of football in Britain. If you're a bit of a sports archaeologist, you can see the evidence for the great shift in the fortunes of the two sports right here in Leeds, where I'm podcasting from. If you've been to Headingley to watch rugby or cricket, you may well have driven past the Cardigan Fields Leisure Park on Kirkstall Road. It stands opposite the famous Cardigan Arms pub and it's packed with the usual identikit food chains, gyms, bowling alley and cinema. But 130 years ago, Cardigan Fields was the place to watch state-of-the-art rugby played in front of some of the biggest crowds that had ever been seen in rugby or soccer. From 1880 to 1889, every Yorkshire Cup final apart from one was played here, attracting five-figure crowds that eclipsed soccer attendances and often outstripped even those at the FA Cup final itself. In fact, up until the mid-1880s, soccer played second fiddle to rugby right across Britain. Manchester, Liverpool and even the North East around Newcastle were seen as strongholds of the rugby game. So what happened? How did soccer eclipse rugby? Why did rugby lose its dominance? This is the story of rugby's great own goal. Let's go back to the start. When the Rugby Football Union was founded in January 1871, Bell's Life, then Britain's leading sports weekly newspaper, wrote, "Every year has increased the superiority in point of numbers and popularity of the rugby clubs over those who are subject to the rule of the Football Association." Bell's Life saw no reason why rugby's place as the premier winter sport would not continue. After all, at the Football Association's annual general meeting in 1870, 7 years after it was founded, it had just 26 adult clubs in membership. In contrast, the RFU had 20 adult clubs at its very first meeting a few months later in 1871. And by the time the 1874-75 season kicked off, it had 113 clubs under the rugby banner. The FA, despite being formed 7 years earlier, had only 78. A decade later in 1880, the Times pointed out that the players of the rugby union game are probably twice as numerous as those of the Football Association. In the north, the Leeds, Wakefield and Manchester clubs are prominent among a people who are one and all enthusiasts at the game. But in 1871, the seeds of change began to be sown. The FA decided to launch a knockout cup competition, the FA Cup, and over the course of the next decade, the FA Cup became the catalyst for soccer to expand across the country. Not only did the FA Cup mean that teams now had something to play for, all other matches at this time were friendlies, but it also meant that matches could become the focus for local rivalries, for teams from opposite ends of the country to play each other, and, as the sport spread across society, for working class teams to play sides from the elite of British society. The best example of this is the 1878 match between the Lancashire mill town of Darwin against Old Etonians at the quarter-final stage of the FA Cup. Darwin drew 5-5 in the first match, then 2-2 in the second match, before finally succumbing 6-2 to the former public schoolboy side. It was a match that captured the national imagination, not just because of its epic nature, but also because it pitted representatives of the British ruling class against representatives of a northern working class textile town. Such a meeting of these two classes was impossible in any other sphere of British life, and it gave soccer a social meaning that resonated far beyond a simple contest for a sporting trophy. But in contrast, the Rugby Football Union's fear of mass spectator sport meant that they refused to allow a rugby version of the FA Cup to take place. In 1876, the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich offered a cup to the RFU for a national knockout competition, but was turned down. More famously, in 1878, the recently disbanded Calcutta Rugby Club gave the RFU a Challenge Cup to be annually competed for by all rugby union clubs. The RFU wrote back to the club explaining the difficulties of all clubs playing together, and instead the trophy found fame as the Calcutta Cup for the England vs Scotland match. Rugby Union Secretary Rowland Hill argued against cup contests on the grounds that "we again venture to enter our earnest protest against Challenge Cup competitions. Why are they continued? It is said that they aid materially in increasing an interest in the game. Rugby football requires no such unhealthy stimulants." The problem was simply that the RFU's leaders disliked not being able to select their opponents. The Sporting Gazette, another leading weekly paper of the time, even published a guide to which clubs could be considered gentlemen's clubs, so that clubs would not accidentally play what they saw as a socially inferior side. But in a cup competition, who knows who you'll get in the draw? Rugby's lack of a national tournament gives soccer a huge advantage as the two codes battle for new supporters. In 1884, a letter to the weekly The Field newspaper argued that, unless a Rugby Union Challenge Cup be speedily established, in a few years the association clubs throughout the kingdom will outnumber those of their rivals by at least 10 to 1. The failure of the RFU to organise a national cup competition was most damaging in Lancashire. Here, with the exception of some of the East Lancashire mill towns, soccer had played second fiddle to rugby until the late 1870s. But the success of local Lancashire soccer cups and leagues eroded rugby's position. The refusal of the Lancashire RFU to organise a county-wide cup competition, like the Yorkshire Cup across the Pennines, meant that cities such as Liverpool and Manchester, the old strongholds of the rugby game, were gradually colonised by soccer. The round ball game was also given a huge boost in the 1880s by the success of Lancashire clubs in the FA Cup, which brought national fame to towns like Blackburn, whose Blackburn Olympic became the first northern side to win the cup in 1883. The scale of the swing from rugby to soccer can be gauged by the fact that Burnley and Preston North End were both rugby teams until the early 1880s. The legalisation of professionalism by the FA in 1885 and the formation of the Football League in 1888 also gave soccer a national prominence and a competitive structure that undermined rugby's appeal even more. But despite efforts to force the Lancashire Rugby Union to organise a Lancashire Cup competition, rugby had a significant body of opinion that welcomed the rise of soccer. The loss of followers to the grand old game of rugby is regrettable, wrote one RFU supporter in the 1889 Football Annual. Yet looking at the present state of all professional sports, we cannot but think that this possible loss is far preferable to legalising professionalism. Soccer was also helped by the civil war that broke out over the RFU's 1886 amateur rules. Rugby players and clubs were suspended for breaking the RFU's anti-professional regulations, and the increasingly chaotic organisation of rugby contrasted sharply with the efficiency of the Football League. Public perceptions of rugby as a fractured sport at war with itself did nothing to help win new supporters or players. The truth was that the majority of rugby's leaders did not want to popularise their game. Many were horrified by mass spectator sport and wanted nothing to do with it. For them, rugby was a sport for the moral education and physical recreation of its players, and not for spectators. The commercialism and crowds of soccer and rugby in the north were an abomination to them. The football players of the future will be compelled to forget the honourable traditions of the great English game and to pander to the howling mob that crowd the circular stands of some Yorkshire Rugby Coliseum, warned Bertram Russell in 1895. Not to be outdone, the journalist Glyn Roberts later explained that, "I visit a soccer match once a season to keep my disgust fresh," a sentiment that appears to have been widespread if rarely expressed so sharply. The results of this attitude quickly became clear. Just over a decade after rugby's 1895 split, the Football Association had over 7,500 affiliated clubs, roughly 15 times the number of rugby clubs in the RFU and the Northern Union combined. With hindsight, if the RFU had have accepted the offer of a cup from the Calcutta Club in 1878, rugby could have perhaps consolidated its dominance of the winter sports scene, and the popular appeal that the FA Cup had brought to soccer might have been thwarted. Cup finals between the leading northern teams like Wakefield or Wigan and the elite southern middle-class clubs such as Blackheath or Richmond would have captured the national imagination, and rugby would have remained the dominant national winter sport of Britain. And who knows what that would have meant for the development of football around the world in the 20th century. In short, the RFU's refusal to create rugby's own version of the FA Cup was probably the greatest own goal in the history of British sport. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Rugby Reloaded podcast. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my name is @CollinsTony, or one word. And if you want to dig a bit deeper into the history of rugby and the other football codes, take a look at the Rugby Reloaded website at www.rugbyreloaded.com. Next week we'll be following up on the recent BBC Wales documentary The Rugby Codebreakers and asking why the Welsh play the wrong type of rugby. Until then, thanks for listening.